Alright, value is a term in art that refers to like light and dark. So at different values you have darks, lights, and midtones. And those are exactly what they sound like. Even more here, dark, and then it scales up through midtones all the way up to light values. And on these letters, they change over a smooth gradient. It's called a value scale, where you can, if you rub hard with your pencil, it'll be dark, and then as you decrease pressure, you get to lighter and lighter colors. And it's kind of a challenge to see how smooth you can make that scale. So this is a gradient. And right now I'm about 50% gray. I can go lighter and lighter. I'm coloring with the side of my pencil lead, so I'm not using the point much at all. So it's fading off into nothing. So the angle of the pencil to paper is like, if this is the paper, the pencil lead is touching it sideways. So you get a nice smooth surface. You can change over a smooth gradient like this. You can also use contrast. If you put a dark and a light value right next to each other, any area of a picture that has high contrast is going to be very attention getting. So for example, if I had a scene, I'll do a little thumbnail sketch here. If I had a scene with some mountains in the background that were kind of mid-tones, maybe they're far away. So atmospheric perspective makes things far away look hazy. You can see that when you're outside, especially if it's kind of a humid area. But then if I had, and then maybe back here the mountains are even lighter. So there's not a lot of contrast right here. But if I had a tree growing up from the foreground, and that tree was dark, then it would be attention getting, right? Because it's in front of these light values. So that's a way to add contrast. I have midtones and light tones, and then right in the middle of that I just have a tree that's very starkly standing out. The thing that you can use values to create is shading. That's really what they're used for in artwork. So shading uses value, and it creates light and shadow. And light and shadow turn a shape into a form. So for a shape, we might have the shape of a circle. So I'm just going to trace this button. Alright, so a circle is a shape. It's two-dimensional, it's flat. Trying not to hit the camera with my pencil. Clean that up a little bit. So a circle is a shape, right? It doesn't have any roundness to it. But if I were to shine a light on it, let's have the light coming from right here. It would, if this was a round ball, a form, right? A form is a 3D shape in space. So a real statue or real ball is a physical three-dimensional form, but using shading you can make a flat drawing look like it has roundness to it. So when a light shines on any object, it makes some areas of light and shadow. Where the light actually shines on this ball is going to create a bright spot, and it's also going to create a shadowed side, a dark side. So I'm going to add some value. I'm going to start with the pretty dark value on this side, and I'm going to build up these values like in a few ways. And then the highlight I'm going to leave white. I'm not going to put any shadow there. But in between this darker side and this lighter side, there's a place where the light's just kind of hitting the side of this ball. And that's going to create a mid-tone. And you can see my shading's pretty rough here. I'm going to smooth it out with my finger. And I want that highlight to look a little brighter. So I'm just going to erase. So I have the highlight, mid-tone, and these names kind of suggest what they are, right? Highlight is the brightest part, the highest light. Mid-tone is a medium color. And then I'm going to put something called, and this is the shadowed side, or shaded side, we'll call it. Shaded side. Writing faster than, or my brain's going faster than my hand. So the shaded side. Now in that shaded side you have almost like a crescent moon shape that's even darker, especially underneath. And I'm going to add one more kind of shadowed tone in here. You can adjust your shading a lot as you go. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. This part here that's opposite the light and is pretty dark has what I think is a pretty cool name, which is the core of shadow. Sounds like something you'd have to find in a game. And that's this darkest kind of half moon shape. Now, this ball kind of looks like it's floating in space. So let's say it's sitting on a table, right? The light's over here. It's going to cast a shadow, which is a flat oval, right? It's coming from that ball, but it's laying flat on a table. And the cast shadow, depending on how much other light is in the scene, can be different values. I'm just going to make it kind of a medium dark value and a fairly flat color. It might get a little bit darker towards the ball, but it's going to be a pretty flat value. So this is the cast shadow. It's the shadow that's being cast by the object onto something else. Could be onto a table, could be onto a wall. So cast shadows are, like if you think of, like if you make shadow animals with your hands, that's casting a shadow. And there's another kind of shadow that goes right in here. If you look at your fingers, right, there's not actually outlines on real objects, but if you squeeze your fingers together, you can see that there is a dark line, and that's because the light doesn't get out of there. And that's called, it's right underneath here. The light's basically squeezed out from the space in between the ball and the table. So it makes a very intense area of shadow with a special name, and that's called an occlusion shadow. To occlude means to block. Alright, so highlight is the brightest part. It's where the light's actually hitting the object. The midtones are where the light's kind of going by at an angle. So if you look at it from above, the highlight's here. The midtones are kind of this area where it's got halfway light. This back side, where the core of shadow is, no light's actually hitting it from that light source, but light is coming from other areas and kind of bouncing back onto it. So it's not completely black, right? It's not like in space where there's really stark shadows. And then behind it, you see stretched out this other shadow where this light that's coming all around it is getting blocked, but it's still hitting this table. Now, because light's coming back, there's one more piece of this drawing that gives it a real sense of three-dimensionality and is very helpful if you remember it, which is a reflected light. The reflections are something that will help your drawings really have dimension to them, because every place where there's light, it bounces around, and this reflected light makes it seem like this ball has a backside that continues around to where more light's coming from. It's not just facing the shadow, it actually continues on. So this drawing has maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values, from the lightest to the darkest. It's got, I would say, 2 things I would count as midtones. This is definitely a midtone, and then there's a little bit darker midtone. And then, so there's these parts of this diagram. And this is one of the things that's like a basic shading exercise, but it's very helpful to know. And it's one light source in a simple form. Obviously, in real life, you might have multiple things in a scene, multiple forms, and light could be coming from more than one source. Like you could have the sun and a lamp, you could have street lights and car lights, you could have colored lights. So once you start to play with shading and light, you can have a lot of variety. But this is just a simple exercise to try if you want to give your drawings some three-dimensionality.